And we are ready to start. Thank you very much all for joining us. We are seeing good friends now joining us. John Braithwaite, hello. So it's exciting. And my name is David Levy-Faur, and I'm the host of this webinar. The webinar is part of two series of projects that I'm a part of, involved in. One is on theories of regulation and governance, and the other one is on injustice and redress, a new project that I'm involved with. And today with us, two very respectable and leading scholars, Wim Huisman and Susanne Karstedt, both criminologists, both well respected senior scholars in their field. They will speak about corporate atrocities or corporate involvement in atrocity crimes. Before I give the floors to both of them, I will just say that Wim is a professor of criminology at the Vrije University of Amsterdam. He's also head of the Vrije Universiteit School of Criminology, past president of the Netherlands Society of Criminology, co-editor-in-chief of the journal Crime, Law and Social Change, and more and more and more. You can read more about Wim in the YouTube videos that we will produce out of this talk. And now from Wim to Susanne Karstedt, professor of criminology at School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University, Australia. She's a comparativist working on policy-relevant comparative criminology. Numerous awards. I will not mention all of them. You will have the opportunity to read more later on. She's pioneered work on atrocity crimes, international criminal justice, and transnational justice, including state crimes, crimes of the powerful and the elite. So it's really exciting to host you here, both of you, on this very important topic. So we know that corporations are involved in crimes, but you focus also on atrocities. And before you start the presentation, and I know you have a few examples, I'd like you to give 1 minute, 2 minutes talk, each of you, why you are in this topic, what brought you to this topic, which kind of examples made you decide to work on those issues personally. Do you want to start, Susanne? Maybe?
Yes, I started to work on a state crime and atrocity crimes, I think, at around 2010, but I'm German. I was also very much interested in transitional justice. I did a lot on the life of those who had been sentenced at Nuremberg, the perpetrators of the Holocaust. And I think the main reason why I embarked on this project is that Wim came to Australia and he had this very interesting project. And so I said to him, I would like to become involved and join him in these analyses. And we started working together. And we have, which Wim soon will show you, we have already published on this project. And Wim and Annika in Free University, they have a data set. And my suggestion was to quantify this data set and start analyses with it.
Thank you, Susanne. And Wim, thank you.
Yeah, you already heard the second part of the story by Susanne. I think it started for me. I have been studying white-collar and corporate crime as a criminologist from when I was a student. So my PhD study was on corporate crime in the Netherlands. And if you look at textbooks on corporate crime, it's about environmental crime, occupational safety and health violations, manufacturing crime, financial frauds, etc., but not on human rights violations. Well, I think it was 2009 at my university, the VU School of Criminology. We just started a new master program on the criminology of international crimes and a research program. Actually, the Netherlands is a very nice place to study international crimes, not because we have so many such crimes committed in our country, but of course, in a way, we are the legal capital of the world with the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, etc. So at that time, when my colleagues started doing research on those international crimes, the breaches of international criminal law, they were studying mostly perpetrators like dictators and militia leaders, etc. But at that time, we had 2 cases in Dutch courts against 2 Dutch businessmen who had been convicted. Actually, these were among the first convictions for complicity to war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Netherlands. And these were 2 businessmen. And because of their business operations and their companies, they become involved in those crimes. And that made me realize that there is also another type of perpetrator, actor involved, and that's companies. And that could be a new form of corporate crime. And that's how I started.
Yeah. Thank you for giving us the background and now for the presentation. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us from Australia and from Netherlands. And we are looking forward. So please share.
So, well, of course, David, I would like to start also on behalf of Susanne, thanking you for the opportunity to present our work, our research project, to such a very interesting audience, the members of this series of webinars. Yeah, we are very honored and glad to have this opportunity. As we explained, we have been collaborating on this for more than 8 years now, but it's very much a team effort. So Susanne and I today will present the study, but as you see below on this slide, we collaborate with various other colleagues who I would like to introduce briefly. So in the beginning, when I started, I had a student who also did her PhD research on this project, which is Annika van Baar. She is at my university, and she has been involved in the data collection and the qualitative analysis of the cases that we will present. Susanne brought along her student Lorena Rivas, who has been doing data collection as well, and who was responsible for the coding of the cases that we have. And finally, we have Rebecca Entricht, who is also with us today, who is responsible for the technical stuff, the quantitative analysis together with Susanne. So to briefly introduce the topic, as regulation scholars, you are probably aware that there are soft law standards on business and human rights, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and they are becoming transformed into hard law in various countries, but also on an international level. For instance, it was, I think, only the last couple of weeks and days that the proposal for an EU corporate sustainability due diligence directive was approved by the EU Council and also by an important committee of the Dutch Parliament. So perhaps this will become reality in the near future. And so we have this, you could say, cascade of regulation in the field of business and human rights. And in a way, with our research project, we want to offer or provide an empirical base to those efforts with studying the nature, the prevalence, and the causes of such involvement of corporations in human rights violations, and also by looking at the responses to those involvements in human rights violations. And while being criminologist perhaps also explains why we don't look at any human rights violation, but we look at the most serious, the most heinous human rights violations, those that from a criminological perspective we could qualify as atrocity crimes, or perhaps from a more legal point of view, international crimes. So in this presentation, first I will say something about the research project and the data and the methodology. Then second, Susanne will take over in presenting the results of what is basically the next step, the second step in our research project. Third, I will illustrate some of the cases that come with the groups that Susanne will present. And then finally, the last part of the presentation is about the benefits of the incentives of the corporations and the extent to which they are involved in extreme violence. And Susanne will present that last part as well. And then we have time for questions. So our story starts, perhaps you could say, in Nuremberg, already mentioned by Susanne. Here you see a picture of executives of what was at that time the largest corporation in the world, the chemical corporation IG Farben. And here you see executives standing trial in the famous Nuremberg trials because of the involvement of the corporation in the Nazi crimes, for instance, by using forced labor coming from Auschwitz destruction camp. And at that moment, you could say also from a legal point of view, this phenomenon of corporate involvement or corporate executives being involved in the commission of those types of atrocity crimes was framed. Well, flash forward, Stockholm last year, in fall, here you see executives of the former company Lundin Oil, I think now it's called Oron Energy, also going to court because the former chair and the former CEO are prosecuted for complicity in war crimes committed in Sudan, where the company was operated at the end of the last millennium. They demanded the Sudanese military, or had agreements with the military, in assistance in securing conditions in the area where the oil field was, Block 5A, for operations, for being able to start oil exploration. And as a result of this, allegedly over 12,000 civilians were killed and 116,000 were displaced, amounting to war crimes for which these two corporate executives are now prosecuted in Sweden. So this already gives us an illustration of the time span that we're looking at. This is just to advertise our first publication, Susanne was already referring to, in the Oxford Handbook on Atrocity Crimes, in which we introduced this topic and gave the basic descriptives. And today we present for the very first time the results of the second phase of our project on more like the patterns and the risk profiles of the types of cases that we have in our database. Saying so, that means indeed we have set up a database. So it's based on case studies, cases of alleged involvement of corporations into these atrocity crimes. We find the cases and analyze the cases by using open sources, often the results of investigative work done by NGOs, human rights groups, but also in many cases pending legal proceedings, civil lawsuits, criminal lawsuits. And our threshold of including cases is that there are substantiated accusations made by reliable organizations or their court cases of such involvement by corporations. So on the one hand, it's historical because these cases often happened in the past, starting with the cases that are related to the Holocaust, the Second World War, also in Asia, but ongoing until today, as was illustrated by the Luning case. It's based on the crimes which are criminalized in the Rome Statute, which is, of course, the basis of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So these are war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and crimes of aggression. Well, we tried to find as much information on these corporations, the crimes, the perpetrators, the context as possible. For this, we have created what we call a qualitative database with all the case descriptives, and besides qualitative analysis of the cases. And this was the idea that Susanne came up with when I visited her in Brisbane at Griffith University, to also code this information for quantitative analysis. So we code for items like the type of companies, the types of industries, the types of crime, the nature of the involvement, the perpetrators of the crime, the nature of the business dealings with those partners in crime, and the legal and extra legal responses to those cases of involvement. And today we would like to present the results of latent cluster analysis to get like a risk profile, you could say, of the cases. What are risky businesses for companies to become involved in these forms of serious crime? So for this analysis, we have 208 cases. It's ongoing, so we try to find new cases, but for this analysis, we have used a batch of 208 cases, which include, just for your information, more than 20 cases of involvement in the Holocaust, but also cases of, for instance, Japanese companies in the same time frame in Asia being accused of involvement in such crimes. But it starts therefore in the 1930s, but it runs until today, and it covers all global regions. So that is for introducing the data and the goal of the project. For the presentation of the model and the first findings for this second step in the analysis, I turn it over to Susanne.
But you have, okay. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, I first would like to introduce our model that we set up. You can see on the left hand those determinants that we thought, or those factors that we thought actually could develop, could become a pattern of a risk profile of these corporations. There is the industry type. Then there is the partner in crime, the actual perpetrator, because nearly all of these corporations are not directly involved. And then there is the type of involvement, that is the way in which how they are cooperating or what they are contributing to the crime. So in legal terms, complicity or aiding and abetting. On the right-hand side, you see what we want to analyze. On the one hand, we think that these risk factors are related to what companies assume would be a gain for them. What are the incentives for doing this? And the second part is the involvement in extreme violence. We need to realize that we only have cases who were involved. So this is in a way our way of finding out what actually a kind of dependent variable of this type of involvement. Just to introduce now how we categorize this. So here you see the types of industries that are included in our research. These are, we have 10 types topped by extractive industries, that is fossil fuels, oils, gems, and so on. And this tops the list because also in the WWII report, the first for the UN, extractive industries are most important. We have then financial services, we have manufacturing. Important is infrastructure, this is transport, this is logistics, this is also construction. We have increasingly surveillance software, telecommunications, hardware and software. And we have in supply chains, fashion, footwear, and so on. Finally, also private military companies and security companies or consultancies. And what you can see here, we have those that are directly related to conflicts like private military and others that might contribute goods, but not all those who are producing something would also contribute their goods. For example, breweries would certainly not provide beer or beverages, but they will provide funding or logistics for transport and so on. This leads us on to the type of involvement, and we have 3 categories here. One is logistical support, that is building infrastructure also for surveillance, transportation, consultancy. And we have the direct supply of goods. Of course, arms play a role here, but also equipment and IT. And then finally, funding like loans, insurance, concessions, and also, of course, bribe paying. The partners we just had categorized 2 main groups. One are partners of the where the partner is the state. These are all state agents that are normally getting involved in state crime and state violence. And then we have non-state actors, which are rebel or insurgent groups, also militia. Militias that are directly funded by the state are here for us, are also part of the state actors. Here is our right-hand side now. What are the incentives? And we identified 3 types. One is operational gains, for example, for extractive industries, security from attacks or chances to more exploitation of the environment, displacement of people to expand operations. We have improved trade competitive positions. This is mainly trade in conflict commodities, but also goods and services. And finally, gains from the repressive practices of the state or the government, for example, strikes and union activity suppression, which leads on to exploitation of labor. And our categorization of extreme violence categorizes all violations, severe violations of physical integrity from all 3 types of crime of the Rome Statute, and we juxtapose that to other, which we define as less violent. That does not mean that there is no violence, but they are less violent than these most serious ones. So a brief overview over the distribution of cases, and I start in the 1930s and 40s. These are here, of course, the Holocaust cases and the cases from Japan and Korea. In the 1950s and 60s, we mainly have cases in apartheid South Africa. In the 1970s, you can see there is a big spike. These are the Latin American dictatorships, and the repressive action, in particular the Argentina dirty war, with massive violations of human rights and atrocities. In the 1980s, we have Iraq, Papua New Guinea, the conflict, but still the ongoing conflict in South Africa. And in the 1990s, we have and the 2000s, these are the African civil wars and genocide, with both, in particular, with war in Congo. And finally, in the 2010 up to now, we have here China and the repression of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, and cases from Myanmar. So this decade has been a particularly Asian one. So I'm going now to the risk profiles, and here we have the first cluster, and you can see that it really looks like a radar. That our first cluster of groups is infrastructure and technology, and since World War II. What you can see if you look at our radar, this is mainly the category of infrastructure. The partner is usually the state, and the type of involvement is the supply of goods, but also transport. So our examples here are, and that now you can look at the regions of the host country. The examples are, for example, transport, railways, French, Dutch, and so on in the Holocaust. Then Japan and Korea, mainly with occupation and industries there. We have South Africa apartheid, with a number of German companies, Siemens, AEG, who mainly provide infrastructure for surveillance throughout the conflict. And as I said, it is mainly here the state who is the partner in crime. We have cases also from Africa here, here in Rwanda, that is weapons and transport that was provided by a company. Our second cluster we have called Resource Curse of Africa and 1990 to 2010. And this is indeed this area, this is the Great Lake region, and the main area, the main country is Congo. But we also have here Nigeria with oil companies. We have South Africa with Rio Tinto. So these are the typical extractive industries, and this pattern is clearly defined by this. What is interesting is that, of course, extractive, what do they do? And here you can see that most of what contributes to the crime is funding. And it is now cooperation with both state and non-state actors. Funding goes to rebels in supply chains, for example, or in commodity trading, but also to the state, and at pretty equal proportions. Our third cluster, which is very clearly defined, now includes arming states and providing arms. But we have here again, and you can see that with regard to the region, we have here a quite large number of Holocaust cases with the big armament industries and their usage of forced and slave, and in particular slave labor. arms are also provided by Swiss companies to South Africa, Oerlikon and Böhle, mainly weapons for security forces. In the later 2010 to 2020, Yemen is a country with a lot of cases. And here it is in particular aviation industries, Airbus, Dassault, and so on, who provide actually mainly the state with equipment in the conflict. Our cluster for repression of social economic conflict is, as you have already seen before, the clear South American cluster, mainly defined by manufacturing. And out of our 33 cases here, 24 are alone from Argentina. The others are from Brazil and Colombia. So what they provide is actually support, logistical support for the suppression of insurgent groups. And given that they are corporations, they mainly support the suppression of unions and suppression of labor conflict. Their partner is exclusively the state here. And what is interesting in particular in the case of Argentina is that the majority of these corporations or companies are actually local companies. Sometimes they are subsidiaries, but many of them are actually local companies. However, besides of this, you have in Brazil, for example, Volkswagen involved, in Argentina, Ford, and so on. With the fifth cluster, we now identify the finance sector, and this includes 19 cases, and of course they do funding. Interesting with this cluster is clearly financial services provide funding in terms of credit, in terms of insurance, and so on, in particular for transnational operations. But funding is closely related to infrastructure. And so the funding, the financing of infrastructure projects is here very closely related. What is also interesting is that actually non-state actors play a huge role in this funding, and this is related to the supply chains and to the trade chains that are related to extractives. In this cluster, we have again two big clusters, two separate subclusters. These are Holocaust cases on the one hand, and the African Congo cases on the other hand. They dominate this cluster. For Congo, we have Belgian, German, US, and French banks funding the extractive industries. And in the Holocaust, we have all the big German banks involved in funding and so on. We have French banks, and we have also insurance. And in Rwanda, the same French bank that was involved in the Holocaust comes up again as a funding corporation. Our last cluster is smallest, it's only 12, and it is absolutely concentrated in Asia with 100%, and in time with 2012 to 2020. And this is mainly the repression of the Chinese state, or the repression of the Uyghurs and Tibetans by the Chinese state and the involvement of companies here who take advantage of labor mainly in camps, internment camps, and in other type of these camps. So the state is clearly the partner here. The support is logistical in terms of providing the infrastructure for this forced labor in these camps. And all major transnational clothes manufacturers are involved here. Adidas from Germany, Nike, Skechers, US, H&M, and so on. Also, for example, companies that provide DNA testing for controlling and identifying Tibetans and Uyghurs. So these are the clusters, and I think now Wim will give you some examples, some cases for each of them.
Thank you so much, Susanne. Yes, indeed, we thought it was nice to illustrate these 6 clusters that our technique found with one case for each cluster. So the first cluster is about infrastructure, utility, and technology companies facilitating the crimes of mainly state actors by supplying logistics and instruments. And a good case to illustrate this perhaps is the case involving the French National Railway Company, SNCF, which is alleged of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity by knowingly transporting Jews and other victims to the Nazi death camps in World War II. So 3 lawsuits were filed against the company, tort lawsuits in the US. These were all dismissed. But there was a judgment in a French court in 2006 in which the French state and the railway company were found guilty of colluding in the deportation of Jews during the war, and they were ordered to pay compensation to the families of victims. So in 2010, the executives at that time of the company apologized for the role of the company in deporting the Jews in the war, and thousands of Holocaust survivors and family members were compensated from a $16 million fund, French-US fund. And this success led to initiatives in other countries, such as my own country, also had to, by the Dutch railway company, for instance, to apologize and offer compensation for the same facts for Dutch victims of the Holocaust. So cluster 2 is about the resource curse, mainly in Africa, but also in some other research-rich areas in the world, also in Asia. But a typical case, I guess, of the typical cases come from the DRC, as Susanne explained. Many are about extraction, but we also have cases further down the supply chain, such as this one. The Swiss gold refinery, Argor-Hereux, I don't know whether my pronunciation is correct, but they were accused by an NGO trial that they had been involved in the pillage by the rebel group FNI from the northeastern region of the DRC of gold. The FNI accused a rebel group accused of committing war crimes at the International Criminal Court of Justice, and they allegedly used the proceeds from the sale of gold to finance its operations and the purchase of arms, and allegedly the company was involved in this supply chain. So the Swiss prosecutor opened up a criminal investigation into the complaint by trial, but it was closed in 2015. The prosecutor concluded that there was not enough evidence that the company was aware of the criminal origin of the gold to prosecute the company. The third cluster is about manufacturing companies supplying the goods to state perpetrators, many about arms, such as this one. In 2022, NGOs have filed a criminal complaint in France, requesting the investigation into the potential complicity of 3 French arms manufacturers, Dassault Aviation, Thales, and missile producer MBDA, in aiding and abetting the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity, for their role in supplying and maintaining weapons of the Saudi-led coalition fighting a war in Yemen. And these human rights groups also filed a communication to the International Criminal Court for the same facts, looking at a series of 26 airstrikes allegedly perpetrated by the coalition on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Yemen that could amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. And this investigation is still ongoing. The fourth case is indeed mostly about manufacturing companies involved in suppression of labor conflict by military juntas in Latin America, such as this case. This is a rare case because it's one of the few in which we actually have criminal convictions of corporate executives. Here you see 2 of the former executives of the local plant of Ford Motor Company. And Ford was accused of helping the Argentinian military dictatorship in the 1970s in the political repression, abductions, and mistreatments of Ford workers and union organizers. The company gave out the names of trade unionists to the military junta, who were taken in company vehicles to torture centers. And the military even operated a detention and torture center at the Ford plant facilities. 25 company employees and trade union leaders were illegally detained and tortured for this. These executives were convicted in 2018. Cluster 5, which is about financing. This is an interesting case. In 2020, French prosecutors have opened up an investigation into one of the largest French banks, BNP Paribas, over allegations of complicity in crimes against humanity in Sudan. The plaintiffs say that the French bank was complicit in crimes against humanity because it provided financial services for the Sudanese government. This case is still ongoing, but for the same context, the same case, in a US sanctions violations case, the US Department of Justice described BNP Paribas, the bank, as Sudan's de facto central bank from the end of the 1990s until 2007, because it gave the Sudanese government access to international money markets and a means to pay staff, to pay military and security forces who committed war crimes in Sudan. And the bank agreed to pay the huge fine of almost $9 billion. And an example of the last cluster, which is mainly about retail and consumer goods companies accused of supporting the Chinese government in the suppression of the Uyghur people. In my country, but also in Germany, for instance, in 21, the European Center of Constitutional Rights submitted a criminal complaint against several Dutch and US textile and fashion brands who have their headquarters in Europe and in the Netherlands, arguing that these may have been directly or indirectly complicit in the forced labor of members of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province in China. And they asked the Dutch public prosecutor to investigate the corporation's alleged complicity in human rights violations that could amount to crimes against humanity. And this case is still under investigation. And with these illustrations of the cases in each cluster, I again turn it over to Susanne for the final part of our presentation.
So here is now what we want to explain with our risk clusters. And why the motivation to take risks and the actual risk to become involved in extreme violence. As I said, this is a little bit of a difficult differentiation, but these are really the most serious violent crimes here. So we start with improving one's competitive position. And as you can see for the mean level, this is indeed quite common for all corporations. Nearly 2/3 have this as an incentive. What is interesting here is that the extractive industries in Africa and also those industries in corporations in Latin America that supported the repression of the dictatorships in Latin America are actually less involved here. And of course, for our cluster 2, the extractive industries, that has a lot to do with how these industries operate, whilst, for example, in the case of the Latin American cluster, this has a lot to do with that they were already in the country, they were part of it, but this was the context that developed in these very violent ways. And here you can see what extractive industries do. That is, they have operational gains mainly. Operational gains in terms of security of operation, of expanding operations, of getting having their infrastructure and their large investments secured. These are 2/3 of our groups who have operational gains, or 2/3 of them have this. The mean level of operational gains is rather low, only 25%, quarter of all of our corporations have this as a particular motivation or incentive. And finally, we go to gains from repressive practices. That is clearly here the gain for all those corporations that were involved in the Latin American conflicts and the atrocity crimes that were committed by the regimes at the time. So what we find is, and what Wim once said as a title of an article, this is business as usual. So competition, operation are important for these corporations. So actually what we find is that the incentives or the risk-taking is related to the normal corporation, to the normal operation of these corporations. It is not something special to become involved here. If we are looking at involvement in extreme violence, we find that 3/4 are actually involved in extreme violence, which we think is a very high or the highest level. What is interesting in this distribution is that actually, again, those who were the corporations in our cluster 4, the Latin American dictatorships, are the most involved in extreme violence, which is, of course, they were operating in a context that swiftly, fast, and increasingly developed the most violent ways, for example, of disappearances and so on. And if you think most of our cases come from Argentina, and the dirty war in Argentina was excessively violent. So the same message that we can take away from here is that corporate crime in this area is hugely violent. There are non-violent engagements, but most of it is very violent. So a big thank you to all those others who helped, to Annika van Baar, to Rebecca, who is with us, and to Lorena Rivas, and many, many thanks to you all for coming and participating in this seminar. And thank you to David for organizing it.
Thank you very much, both. It was fascinating presentation, and I think I didn't see anything like that. So it's a pioneering work. I will start with a few questions. Defining atrocity crime and what was included and not included would be interesting to know. I will continue with a few questions, and you can decide to take some of them or not all of them, and so on. So defining atrocities, and you know, this is one, and the other one is what is involvement. There is this, I can think about involvement by complicity, or involvement by initiating the crime. You have this kind of typology or distinction between funding, supply, and logistical, but I think it's technical involvement, not the substantive part of this involvement. And the question is, what is the alternative? Now, the other way to go is, you know, involvement by omission or commission, and then the idea, if you take the biggest 100 corporation in the world, how many of them are involved in say atrocities, or just in banal evil, or everyday crimes, or everyday's evil? Can you give us an idea about that? And the last question, or the last comment, is about the legal framework, the global and national level, which deal with this phenomena. So can you tell us something about the legal strategies to fight corporate atrocities? That's all. Too many, I know, but that's all.
Okay.
There are a question in the chat, and I will deliver them soon. But
would you like to pick up any of these that you like?
I think I start with atrocity crimes, and I would like to ask you about perhaps to say something about the legal framework, because I think we work together on that. So for atrocity crimes, we just use the definition of David Sheffer, who was the ambassador at large of the Clinton administration for war crimes, and involved in several, but mainly in the former Czechoslovakia. And he designed, or his idea was to define a cover concept that would include all the three types of crimes in the Rome Statute, in order, in particular, not to, so for example, he said it is better for prevention if we have an idea that these crimes are happening, and not start out with saying, is this a crime against humanity, or is this genocide, or is this and that? So this is just, let us say, a catch term for the Rome Statute crimes that are defined there. And it does not mean that these, of course, these are terrible, serious, violent crimes, but the term atrocity crimes is not indicating in this way a particular evil or a particular heinous crime. It is just a coverage, a term. It is like white collar crime. White collar crime or corporate crime are also not legal terms. They are terms to describe a certain type of perpetrators and what they are doing. And the same is true, I think, we can say the same is true for atrocity crime. So it is the same way as white collar crime. Only it mainly defines the type of action rather than the perpetrators who commit it. Wim, would you like to answer other questions?
Yeah. I think the suggestion you made, David, by looking at the 100 largest corporations in the world and on which we have in our database is really interesting. We have not done that, but I'm quite sure we have quite a few of them. But it also illustrates why, as a threshold, as a criterion for inclusion, we only adopt cases in which other actors, based on substantiated fact-finding, and this is, I guess, hard to operationalize, but being reliable organizations making the accusations. Because looking at the list of the 100, I could come up with my own reasons why I think corporations could be involved in those atrocity crimes, but that would also make it very subjective. I think there are many levels of subjectiveness and also politics and interests in these accusations, but we are not the ones making them. So these accusations have to be made, substantiated, and they have to, and that's in a way a legal operationalization of atrocity crimes, as just explained by Susanne. We're working in a field, corporate crime, in which there has always a debate. Even from the beginning, when Edwin Sutherland coined the term white-collar crime, to what extent should we use a legal-based definition of crime, and to what extent should we, or when should we use a harm-based definition of crime? And in a way, we use a legal-based definition of atrocity crimes because we use the wrong statute. So we're looking for accusations of companies being involved in one of those crimes. And that accusation can be made on 3 levels. It could be an accusation, but this is really rare, that they just say these are international crimes, breaches of international criminal law. Or it could be an accusation of one of the core crimes, but actually these core crimes, of course, are categories. If you look at the Rome Statute, you see the definition of genocide or war crimes or crimes of humanity. There are many underlying crimes, and often the accusation is made for one of those crimes. And then it's the context of and the facts that they come up with, which tells us that the accusation of torture indeed is a crime against humanity. Or, for instance, apartheid is a crime against humanity. So we have quite a few cases about companies being involved in South Africa apartheid, and this would qualify as a crime against humanity. We also use the non-legal term of involvement, referring to our more like empirical approach. Lawyers would say perhaps complicity, but as you already mentioned, David, I think the involvement could mean 2 things: direct involvement, the company or corporate personnel being the perpetrators committing the crimes. We have a few, but not so many. We have private military companies which contractors commit the crimes. We have companies being the direct perpetrators of the destruction of livelihood that could amount to crimes against humanity. But in most cases, it's indirect involvement. State actors, non-state actors committing the crimes, and the companies being involved in the ways we explained.
Can I just add, I thought what you said about commission and omission, I think that is a very interesting perspective and take on it, So actually in this area, I mean, if you look at the requirements of due diligence for these, which are requirements in many of the soft law legal frameworks, so this obviously addresses the question of commission and omission, namely the omission of a proper due diligence. On the other hand, omission and commission applies, of course, to, let us say, the principle of the agents who are committing that, and that is who are committing the crimes, and that would be mainly the state and not a company. So I think it would be interesting to look at due diligence processes in these terms. Thank you very much. That's a really interesting idea.
Thank you very much. And John, do you want to ask directly or to comment directly, because you wrote there? If so, please unmute yourself. If not, just let me know.
Yes, thank you. That was a lovely presentation, very nicely put together. I was so impressed with your diagrams and then the way you illustrated each with a real case. My question is what you might be beginning to learn about the mutual constitution of state crime and corporate crime, and particularly the violence therein. I guess it would be impossible to code whether any particular case is more led by the state or more the state leading the corporation, because that's my sense of these things. Thinking of Congo, for example, that's a very evolving thing where it might be one side that might start by leading, but later on it might be the other side of the corporate state interface that becomes the more important criminal driver, if you like. But that, I think, it's very interesting and important to understand that, but we don't understand that very well.
No, and I think that is really an important part to look at. For example, in the case of all these Argentinian corporations, so how they get involved as the violence increases, and it increased massively and fast. So, or for example, your example from Congo, what kind of interactions are taking place? And I think these might be in-depth case analyses that can look at that, rather than, because we can't code these processes over time, but we haven't done that. To have, let us say, we only know start date, end dates, and so on. So when they moved out, we have reasons for moving out. So that might be in the next step to look at. And this could be also related, because we have collected data now, context data on the countries, the host countries and the home countries. And that might be an idea to look at that context.
If I may add briefly, indeed, I think this is something that we're interested in also the qualitative analysis that we do. Actually, state corporate crime as a theoretical concept was used by Annika in her PhD thesis, which was basically a qualitative analysis of apartheid South Africa, the conflict issue, the conflict commodities in the DRC, and Holocaust cases. And if you're interested, we're most happy to send that dissertation. But these cases, almost all cases, I would say, in the database would qualify as state corporate crimes. But if you look at the state corporate crime literature, a distinction is often made between initiated and facilitated. But this has been presented in that literature as state-facilitated state corporate crime or state-initiated state corporate crime. Looking at our cases, mostly it's the other way around. The main perpetrator are often state actors, and then the cases could qualify as corporate initiated state crime, such as the Lundin case, or corporate facilitated state crime, such as the cases in which companies provide the instrument by which state actors commit the crimes.
I think there was one question on increasing profitability in the chat, and I would just like to respond briefly to that question. We have thought about that. We made an effort, but it is very hard to find out about whether there had been an increase in profitability or not. And therefore, we left it with the more wider concept of improving the competitive position.
Thank you for that. This was a question by Marcus, but you already answered to that. I have two more questions, if you may. Look at the case of PFAS. PFAS is a chemical that was produced in the 60s, 70s, maybe earlier in the States, and now can be found in all in most of the world population, billions of people in our blood. Would this be considered atrocity or not? This is the first question. Would you include it?
What do you think?
You don't know.
There's also, there are the big tobacco industries and so on, which I would rate would be something similar. And I remember a discussion with Wim where we had such a case, and we excluded that because we said we would like to stick just with the Rome Statute and those definitions and the context, the situations that are defined there. So, for example, also, not every arms trade is then a crime. Yeah, so there is legal and illegal arms trade, and that is important. So, as criminologists, we are looking at that.
I see. So,
and perhaps to add that there is an interesting reattempt, I guess, a new attempt, a strong lobby to add a new crime to the Rome Statute, and that is ecocide. So, of course, there are many cases of very serious environmental harm and degradation done by companies. And if they could be, if ecocide would be included in the Rome Statute, and various companies are now also drafting national criminal legislation to criminalize ecocide, that would bring in new cases, I guess, and perhaps cases concerning PFAS as well.
Yeah, and of course the case of opioid and the Sackler family, Purdue case. But you have Purdue, but then you have the chains, the pharmaceutical chains, and so on. So it's when we deal with those issues, the question is the criminal framework too narrow? I'm sorry to deal with all those issues. Do we have to go beyond the narrow legal definition? But one last question is the question of the autonomy of the corporations and their ability to prevent atrocities by omission and commission. To what extent it's increasing or decreasing with time and or in geography? You know, would you say that in the Western world, corporations are less likely to be involved with atrocities with time?
I think, Susanne, go ahead.
I mean, these are allegations, and with all human rights violation allegations with all instruments, the political terror scale, the Cingranelli and Richards scales, the ITT for torture. They are all aware that there is an increase in allegations over time because of more organizations coming in, more attention in the international community. So there have been, for these scales, there have been very good attempts to check that. This has been mainly done by a person named Faris, F-A-R-I-S, and his colleagues. I can give you a good example of that. For example, for the treatment and torture scale, which was only using the reports of Amnesty International. They used in their analyses a variable whether Amnesty had access or not to the country in question and whether that had an impact on the number. So interestingly, when Amnesty didn't have access, it increased the numbers. So there are, I mean, this is what we have to reckon with when we are living or when we are trying to do research in this world or with these types of allegations. But perhaps Wim would like to say something about the legal framework, because I think that mainly gets completely out of the criminological remit, because the legal framework, the soft law and others, there are so many regulatory instruments now or initiatives that are far beyond what criminology does and what, of course, international or criminal law can do. Wim, would you like briefly to say something about that?
Yeah, I think you already delivered the main message here. So on the one hand, this new legislation demanding human rights due diligence, as corporations have to do, anti-money laundering due diligence, etc., is on the one hand giving the tools to corporations to assess risks and to prevent becoming involved in the types of situations that we see in the cases. On the other hand, it also extends liability, because if you do not, this is omission, if you do not live up to these expectations of doing proper due diligence, you will therefore violate laws and could be held accountable, perhaps not so much direct for the commission of the crimes, but for violating what you could say these derivative types of regulation that have the aim to prevent the types of harms that the corporations in our study are finally involved with.
Yeah, I can see that. And last, maybe you want to recommend a project and or a book that you think will take us, that inspired you or will inspire you in the future, for the people who watch or for myself or ourselves. What's the next project or the books that you can recommend, if at all?
Well, we did not answer your question about the legal responses, and we hope to be able to do so because this is the final step in our project. We also code for the various judicial and non-judicial responses in these cases, and we'll produce a paper on that in the near future. As a book, that's really hard to say. What I found an interesting discovery or rediscovery in this project is that actually our field of study, in a way, corporate crime, white collar crime, started with Edwin Sutherland. But in Edwin Sutherland's first book on white collar crime, there was a whole section of corporate involvement in war crimes.
Right. Interesting. Thank you. Susanne, or shall we conclude here?
Yeah, I have learned a lot from there, and increasingly still coming out being published, reports on the involvement of corporations in the Holocaust, and I think these are great histories, for example, of Flick, or even a retailer like Brenningmeier, the Dutch company, and so on and so forth. So I think these kind of case studies are really inspiring, and are really, and inspiring is perhaps the wrong word, but that they give you really great insights into how these processes happened and who made the decisions to get there.
Yeah, I find it, I agree. You presented here a statistical model and analysis, and now you tell us, go also to the case studies and the history, and come back to the statistics probably, and continue this conversation between methods and disciplines and so on. Thank you very much for excellent presentation, very exciting and very important one. I wish you good luck with the project and the new papers, and continue like this. Thank you very much, all.
And thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you to John for staying up so late.
Especially the two Australians are. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.